Under the Sharia law, there is an Islamic law called Hukm al-Tat. Hukm al-Tat can be translated in English as the obedience sentence. This law is usually issued by the Sharia court against any married Muslim woman who refused to join her husband in his house or left his house without any lawful reason and went to her parents' house or somewhere else without his permission or against his wish. Physical abuses such as beating or raping are not considered sufficient grounds for the wife to desert her husband. Islam allows the husband to beat his disobedient wife, and if she refuses his sexual advances, he is empowered by the same law to rape her. When the Sharia court issues the obedience law, it will send a police truck full of cops to the place where the disobedient wife is staying or hiding. The cops have the rights to beat, drag, force, and whatever other means of coercion they find necessarily to use to transfer that rebellious wife to her husband's house. If her close relatives such as her father, brothers, uncles, or cousins stood on their way, then the policemen are also empowered by the law to apply force against those relatives who tried to obstruct justice. They can beat them or arrest them, and if need required they can kill them too. Now, when that first round is performed successfully, whether through shedding of blood or not, then the cop's duty is over and the rest is left for the husband. What the policeman had done is called in the Sharia applying the obedience law. In other words, they had carried out the order of the Sharia court by taking the disobedient wife from where she was found to the Bait al-Tat, the house of obedience. The Bait al-Tat is worse than a maximum security prison. This house can be any locked-up room inside the husband's house. Even a storage room or toilet can be used for this purpose. The disobedient wife will be imprisoned inside that small room indefinitely. During her confinement, she will be denied all her rights as a human being, including her basic needs. She will be starved deliberately, beaten up continuously, and raped daily by the man she doesn't want to live with, her so-called husband. This harsh treatment will continue until her devils leave her head and her spirit of resistance and disobedience crumbles. Many Muslim clerics teach that after Eve disobeyed God and ate the forbidden fruit, she became permanently possessed by Satan. According to Islam, every woman is inherently possessed by devils and her head always haunted by jinn and ghosts. Thus, the Prophet of Islam said, the woman comes in the form of Satan and retreats in the form of the devil. Imprisoning the disobedient wife in the Bait al-Tat is part of the Sharia's teachings. The matter is not just left for the husband to do it or not. It is compulsory and considered part of the process of curing the rebellious wife and delivering her from her stubborn nature, inherited at birth. Having explained that inhumane law, let us now see what had happened to Salwa after the judge of the Sharia court issued Hukm al-Tat against her. Samir and Samira presumed it was merely a formality and did not take the Maulana Sheikh Omar al-Badari seriously until they saw policemen entering Sakina's house, with orders to detain Salwa. The cops came on a Friday morning because it was a public holiday and they knew that Haj Osman would be at home when they delivered his errant bride to him. Men are expressly forbidden from the women's section, but that day the policemen defied that divine Islamic restriction and stepped inside the taboo ground of the women and had full unobstructed view of the totem animals without their Islamic coverings. Their early morning raid was not expected and hence Salwa and Sakina were taken by surprise. They were still in their sleeping gowns. They were not given chance to cover their bodies by their saris and veil their faces by niqabs. That Black Friday morning, Samira witnessed the incredible happening right before her eyes. If she hadn't seen it for herself firsthand, there was no way anyone could convince her that it had happened to Salwa. Once again, even if her husband Samir had seen it and related to her, she would not have believed him, what those cops had done to Salwa on that particular Friday morning. While she was watching it in horror, she was questioning her disbelieving eyes. Samir for the first time dared to stand on a chair and observe the goings-on in the women's section. He could not care less if the cops might shoot him or place him under arrest. If it wasn't for the respect of the agreement that he signed with Sakina that he should never ever step a foot inside the women's section, he would have crossed the line in the sand and stepped in. Salwa resisted, cried, and begged the cops not to drag her from her house and separate her from her mother-in-law. The cops paid no attention to her tears, crying, and pleadings. Sakina also wept bitterly and asked the policeman not to drag her daughter out of her house. They continued to drag her physically as if she was a criminal or an animal. When Sulwa understood that the cops were not going to stop taking her by force, she began to fight back, biting one of them on the hand, drawing blood. The policeman screamed for help, resulting in his associates showering Sulwa with blows and kicks with their heavy boots. Samira could not control herself as she saw her friend was being hammered mercilessly. At first, she was so outraged until her mind was confused. She shouted at her husband and called him to come for Sulwa's rescue. When Samir didn't respond to her request, she pleaded with him and told him at least he should call 911 for those lawless human beasts. Samir understood the mental trauma his wife was going through and responded by saying, "There is neither phone nor 911 number to call. Besides, how to call the cops to come and arrest their fellow cops who are performing their duties?" Still locked in her Western mentality and norms, Samira ignored her husband and shouted at the policeman, insisting that they had no right to abuse a defenseless woman in that cruel way. One of the cops threatened her that if she tried to come in between they would place her under arrest and drag her out to their truck along with the disobedient bride. Samir intervened quickly and told his wife in English not to interfere. He did not understand exactly what the cop had said to Samira, but it sounded as if he had threatened the life of his wife. The neighbors usually would peep through the gaps in the fencing and secretly watch any women's fight, wife beating, or daughter being hammered by her father or brother. In that morning the inhabitants of two neighboring houses climbed on chairs and little children on the fencing itself and watched what was going on in Sakina's house. Those neighbors were watching with great amusement as if they were spectators looking on a bunch of rodeo cowboys who were wrestling down a dangerous bull. While the policemen were struggling to subdue Sulwa and take her to their truck, her long dress was rolled up to her waist until her underwear was exposed. The sight of her exposed body led the women to laugh and the men to whistle. None of them bothered to tell the cops that the poor woman was exposed. Once the policemen came to the conclusion that Sulwa was going to be difficult to handle, they decided to tie her up. They twisted her hands behind her back, and handcuffed her, cuffing her feet as well. Sulwa still continued to kick and roll around. The cops joined hands together and with much difficulty carried her bodily out of the house. Then, they threw her body into their truck. Samira and Sakina followed them to the perimeter of the compound where they found Sulwa continuously weeping and begging. Samira also was crying and pleading for mercy for her dear friend Sulwa. Undeterred, the cops climbed in their truck and drove away. After Sulwa had been accosted, Sakina and Samira continued to cry unceasingly for her until they lost their voices and their tears dried up. Sakina blamed herself for not being able to prevent the incident, and Samira was pacing the compound, worried sick that the cops might take her friend somewhere and rape her before performing their official duties. A week had since passed, when Sulwa was transferred by the law to her so-called lawful husband. Sakina and Samira could not contact her or get any information about her. They anticipated that she was locked in any one of the huts in the house of Haj Osman. Was she still in chains or set free? If she was freed from her fetters, how was she to live among her rival wives who hated her and tried to kill her inside her house? They attempted to murder her when they merely heard gossip that she was planning to marry their husband. And now that she actually was married to their husband, what would they do to her? Those worries and more occupied the hearts of Sakina and Samira and gave them sleepless nights and restless days. The absence of Sulwa created a huge gap in the heart of each one of them, and there was nothing in the entire world that could have filled it. As soon as Sulwa left the house, Samir and Samira decided to leave Sudan and return to their country. What they had seen in the flesh was more than what they had expected to see in the Muslim world. After they witnessed how Sulwa was deprived of her freedom, abused, beaten, tied up like a criminal, dragged like an animal, and taken by force as a slave to somebody's house against her wish. Needless to say, she was probably raped by him and remains a captive in his house. The American couple simply could not take it anymore. They did not want to see or learn of any more abuse of women, their limits breached. Leaving the lawless, chaotic, evil, and barbaric society also left them with doubts that anyone was ever going to believe their report. Who was going to believe that which is supposedly sanctioned by Islam and upheld by Sharia law? Samir and Samira concluded that Islam was the most misogynistic and hateful ideology to exist in the history of mankind. Everything coming out of that religion was heinous, gruesome, obnoxious, abominable, dreadful, and sheer evil. It was a personification of evil. The mind that created such hateful religion was the mind of a man who was despicable, disgusting, repugnant, sick, and possessed by Lucifer. The American couple could not make good on their decision to leave because they were worried about the good woman, Sakina. She became akin to a mother to them and especially to Samira. How was she going to live by herself? If they could, they would have adopted her as their own mother and taken her to the States. She was of advanced age. No longer young, the years of unending hardship had bent her back and dimmed her eyes. She complained of hearing problems, blurred vision, and had trouble walking. Salwa was her only joy. And after her loving Ruth, Salwa, was taken away from her, she was now all alone in every sense of the word. Samira repeatedly pleaded Samir to bless her wish to adopt Sakina as her own mother and take her to America, despite the fact that Islam forbade adoption. She also knew that American immigration laws would not allow her to sponsor Sakina unless she was her adopted mother or related to her. Samira decided to help Sakina financially, and also every now and then she would send her some money from the States. The American couple shared their decision with Sakina. The old woman expressed her sadness of missing two loving daughters at the same time. She still encouraged Samira to return to her country. She told her that the woman in Sudan was vulnerable to all kinds of man's exploitations. She also shared her plan with Samira, of her plan to sell her house and move into her brother's house. The news of a brother, or any other relative, was new to Samira, but she greeted the knowledge with joy. Samira announced that she was not going to leave until Sakina's house was properly sold off and she had moved safely into her brother's home. The old woman was so pleased by the gesture, an unheard of mercy in a hard land. Selling a property in a Muslim country is not easy unless it is registered under your name. Sakina's house was registered in the name of her late husband who had passed away many years ago. According to Sharia law, if Sakina had a surviving child, that child stands to inherit the house. In case of multiple children, the house would be sold and the proceeds divided among the siblings. The division is not equal across the genders. Let us assume that Sakina had a son and a daughter. The son would get twice as much as the daughter is eligible for, as is written in the Quran, Surah 4, 11-12, 176. If the house was sold for $30,000, the son would get $20,000 and the daughter $10,000. If she had two daughters and one son, then the son would get $15,000 and the daughters would get $7,500 each. There are many verses in the Quran detailing inheritance and how much the beneficiaries inherit. A will is illegal and unenforceable in Islamic Sharia. The father has no right to decide who to inherit his estate and the quantum. Since Sakina had no living child, then her late husband's brother and sister are entitled to claim in his inheritance. Accordingly, as soon as the news spread that Sakina was planning to sell the house she was living in and move to her brother's house, her brother-in-law and sister-in-law submitted a lawsuit against her at the Sharia court and demanded their shares on the property of their late brother. The Islamic court placed a hold on the sale of the house and invited the disputed parties in for a hearing. After attending the hearing, the court ruled that the disputed property should be sold by the government and the money would be divided between Sakina, her brother-in-law, and sister-in-law. The brother-in-law would get half of the sale proceeds and the second half would be divided equally between Sakina and her sister-in-law. Sakina did not like the ruling of the Sharia court. She raised objection because she knew that her brother-in-law was one of the wealthiest men in the city and he had never come to visit her after her husband died or sent a single piastre to her. Likewise, her sister-in-law was married to a very wealthy man who had many houses and properties. Sakina submitted an appeal to the Sharia court and stated the reason for her objection to its unfair ruling. Not surprisingly, the Islamic court rejected her appeal and ruled again that the house to be sold in the public auction and the money divided amongst them according to the Sharia of Allah and His Messenger. Samir and Samira encouraged Sakina to contest the decision of the Sharia law. They advised her to appoint a lawyer and sue the Sharia court in a civil court. They even promised to cover the expenses of all the legal proceedings until the poor old widow got a fair decision. The American couple postponed their trip home indefinitely, deciding to stay in Sudan until justice was served.